The sound of fabric ripping cut through the empty hallway like a blade. Emma Rodriguez stood motionless as her navy blue dress hung in tatters. The modest hemline she'd carefully chosen that morning, now shredded beyond repair. Brandon Cooper, towering at 6 feet 3 inches above her petite frame, held a strip of torn material in his massive hand like a trophy from a conquered enemy. "Whoops," he sneered, his basketball teammates Kyle Martinez and Josh Williams cackling behind him like hyenas sensing wounded prey. "Guess you should have worn something stronger, Teach. Though I gotta say, we're finally seeing what you've been hiding under all those grandma clothes." But what none of these boys noticed was the subtle shift in Emma's breathing pattern, the way her shoulders squared almost imperceptibly, or the dangerous stillness that had replaced her usual gentle demeanor. They couldn't see the years of training hidden beneath her torn dress, the championship belts collecting dust in her apartment closet, or the fire that was slowly beginning to burn behind her wire-rimmed glasses. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Rodriguez had never planned on being the kind of teacher who changed everything. At 26 years old, she was exactly the type of educator parents love to see in their children's classrooms. Soft-spoken with gentle brown eyes and shoulder-length dark hair that she kept neatly pinned back, Emma looked like she belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting of the ideal schoolmarm. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of modest dresses, comfortable cardigans, and sensible flats that allowed her to chase after energetic third-graders without losing her dignity. She'd grown up in East Los Angeles, the daughter of a mechanic and a seamstress who worked double shifts to send their only child to college. Emma had earned her teaching degree through a combination of academic scholarships, weekend jobs, and a fierce determination to escape the cycle of financial struggle that had defined her childhood. Teaching wasn't just her profession, it was her calling, her way of giving back to kids who reminded her of herself at that age. Riverside Elementary and Middle School sat like a red brick fortress in the heart of Millbrook, a suburban community where manicured lawns spoke of prosperity, and high school basketball games drew crowds that rivaled college events. The combined campus housed kindergarten through 8th grade, with the elementary wing painted in cheerful pastels and decorated with student artwork, while the middle school section took on a more serious tone with its display cases full of athletic trophies and academic achievement awards. Emma's 3rd grade classroom, room 15, was her sanctuary. She'd spent her own money decorating it with reading nooks, educational posters, and comfortable beanbags where struggling students could find their confidence. Her bulletin boards showcased every student's work, not just the best ones, and her desk always held a bowl of individually wrapped candies for kids who needed a little extra sweetness in their day. The walls were covered with thank you notes from former students, photos from classroom celebrations, and motivational quotes that Emma genuinely believed in. What her colleagues and students didn't know was that Emma Rodriguez had lived an entirely different life before stepping into room 15. During her college years at UCLA, she discovered kickboxing at a small gym near campus. What started as a way to stay fit and relieve stress from her demanding academic schedule had quickly evolved into something much more significant. Emma possessed a natural athleticism that her quiet demeanor had always hidden, and under the guidance of trainer Marcus "Tank" Johnson, she'd transformed from a shy education major into a fierce competitor. For 4 years, Emma had dominated the amateur kickboxing circuit on the West Coast. She fought under the name Rodriguez Rocket, earning a reputation for lightning-fast combinations and an uncanny ability to read her opponent's movements before they even knew what they were planning. Her record stood at 23 wins with only 2 losses, both controversial split decisions that many ringside observers believed should have gone her way. Sports blogs had written about her potential to turn professional, and several promoters had approached her with contracts that would have changed her financial situation overnight. But Emma had chosen education over athletics, hanging up her gloves 2 years ago to focus entirely on shaping young minds. She'd moved to Millbrook specifically because Riverside Elementary had an opening for a third-grade teacher and offered the kind of stable, nurturing environment where she believed she could make the biggest difference. The gym membership she maintained was purely for personal fitness, and she'd never mentioned her fighting background to anyone at school. In her mind, Emma Rodriguez, the kickboxing champion, and Miss Rodriguez, the elementary teacher, were two completely separate people. Brandon Cooper represented everything Emma had hoped to leave behind when she'd chosen teaching over fighting. At 17, he carried himself with the arrogant swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. As the son of Millbrook's mayor and the star player on the middle school basketball team that fed into the high school's championship program, Brandon had learned early that rules were more like suggestions when you had the right last name and the right jump shot. Standing 6 feet 3 inches tall with broad shoulders and the kind of athletic build that made college scouts take notice, Brandon used his physical presence like a weapon in social situations. He'd been held back a year in elementary school, officially for academic development, but everyone knew it was really to give him an athletic advantage. Now 17 and still in 8th grade, he towered over his classmates and most of his teachers, a fact he exploited whenever possible. His best friends, Kyle Martinez and Josh Williams, served as his faithful lieutenants in a campaign of low-level terror that had made life miserable for several teachers over the years. Kyle was shorter but stockier, with the build of a future linebacker and a cool sense of humor that complemented Brandon's more direct approach to intimidation. Josh was tall and lanky, not as naturally athletic as his friends, but eager to prove his loyalty through increasingly outrageous stunts and pranks. The three boys had turned disrupting substitute teachers into an art form, and even veteran educators often found themselves dreading the days when Brandon's crew was on their class roster. Their tactics were sophisticated enough to avoid serious disciplinary action while still creating chaos that made effective teaching nearly impossible. They'd perfected the art of plausible deniability, always careful to ensure their worst behavior happened in spaces where adult supervision was minimal or distracted. Emma had first encountered Brandon during her second week at Riverside Elementary, when she'd volunteered to help supervise after-school detention. The middle school students assigned to detention were housed in the elementary wing to separate them from their peers, and Emma had offered to assist Vice Principal Chun with monitoring duties. She'd believed that her patient, nurturing approach might help reach some of the more challenging students. Brandon had tested her immediately, making comments about her appearance that skirted the line between inappropriate and actionable. When she'd asked him to complete his assigned work, he'd responded with exaggerated compliance that mocked her authority while technically following her instructions. His friends had taken their cues from his behavior, creating an atmosphere of barely contained chaos that left Emma feeling frustrated and ineffective. Over the following months, the encounters had escalated gradually. Brandon seemed to view Emma as a particularly interesting challenge, perhaps because her youth and size made her appear more vulnerable than the veteran teachers, who'd learned to avoid confronting him directly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd started showing up near her classroom during transition periods, making comments about her clothing choices and personal appearance that grew bolder with each interaction. The incidents always happened in spaces where other adults weren't present, and Brandon was careful to never cross lines that would result in serious consequences. He'd perfected a tone of voice that could sound respectful to casual observers while conveying clear menace to his target. When Emma had attempted to report his behavior to Principal Harris, she'd been told that boys would be boys, and perhaps she needed to develop a thicker skin for dealing with middle school students. Principal Richard Harris was a man caught between competing pressures in a community where athletic success often overshadowed academic achievement. At 54, he'd been running Riverside Elementary and Middle School for 8 years, during which time the institution had earned recognition for both educational excellence and sports achievements. Harris genuinely cared about providing quality education, but he also understood that Brandon Cooper's father wielded significant political influence in Millbrook. Mayor James Cooper had made substantial donations to the school's athletic programs and was instrumental in securing funding for facility improvements that benefited the entire campus. When concerns about Brandon's behavior reached Harris's desk, they came with the unspoken understanding that any disciplinary action needed to be carefully considered in light of the family's contributions to the school community. Harris had convinced himself that Brandon's behavior was typical adolescent testing of boundaries rather than genuine harassment. The principal had grown up in an era where physical intimidation was often dismissed as character building, and he struggled to understand how a teenage boy's comments could seriously impact an adult teacher's ability to do her job. His standard response to complaints about Brandon involved brief conversations that resulted in warnings but never consequences, substantial enough to change the pattern of behavior. The breaking point had been building for weeks. Spring weather had arrived in Millbrook with the kind of warmth that made everyone eager to shed their winter layers, and Emma had begun wearing lighter dresses that were still completely professional, but showed slightly more of her figure than the heavy sweaters and long pants she'd favored during colder months. These subtle changes in her wardrobe had triggered an increase in Brandon's attention and comments. On the day everything changed, Emma had chosen her favorite navy blue dress, a modest A-line style that hit just below her knees and featured 3/4 sleeves that covered her arms completely. The dress was professional, age-appropriate, and perfectly within the school's dress code guidelines. She'd paired it with a light gray cardigan and her usual comfortable flats, creating an outfit that was both practical for chasing third graders and professional enough for the parent conferences scheduled later that afternoon. The morning had passed without incident, with Emma's third graders working through their mathematics lessons and preparing for their upcoming reading assessments. Her students adored her, responding to her gentle encouragement and creative teaching methods with enthusiasm that reminded her daily why she'd chosen education over athletics. During lunch, she'd eaten in her classroom while grading papers, enjoying the peaceful quiet that allowed her to focus on providing meaningful feedback on her students' work. The afternoon detention assignment had come as a last-minute request from Vice Principal Chun, who needed to attend an emergency meeting with parents of a student involved in a disciplinary incident. Emma had readily agreed to supervise the 8 middle school students assigned to after-school detention, viewing it as an opportunity to build relationships with kids who clearly needed additional support and guidance. Detention was held in the elementary wing's multipurpose room, a space that doubled as a cafeteria during lunch periods and an assembly area for school-wide events. The room was bright and welcoming, with large windows that faced the playground and colorful murals painted by previous classes of students. Emma had arranged the desks in a configuration that allowed her to monitor all students while providing enough space for them to work independently on their assigned tasks. Brandon Cooper, Kyle Martinez, and Josh Williams had arrived together, 15 minutes late and completely unapologetic about their tardiness. They'd taken seats in the back corner of the room, as far from Emma's supervision desk as possible, and immediately began the kind of whispered conversation designed to distract other students from their work. Emma had asked them to separate and work quietly, a request that was met with exaggerated sighs and eye rolls, but eventual compliance. For the first hour of detention, the boys had contained their disruption to subtle activities that challenged Emma's authority without providing grounds for additional consequences. They'd passed notes when they thought she wasn't looking, made faces at other students, and engaged in the kind of low-level defiance that was difficult to address without appearing petty or controlling. As the detention period neared its end, and other students began packing up their materials. Brandon had grown bolder. He'd started making comments about Emma's appearance, beginning with observations about her dress that were technically compliments, but delivered with a tone that made them feel predatory. When she'd ignored his remarks and continued collecting papers from other students, he'd escalated to more direct statements about her figure and what he imagined might be hidden beneath her professional clothing. The final bell had rung at 4:15, releasing the elementary students who'd been staying for after-school programs and leaving the building significantly quieter. Emma had dismissed the detention students one by one as they completed their assigned tasks and demonstrated appropriate behavior. Brandon, Kyle, and Josh had been the last three remaining, and Emma had made the mistake of believing their compliance during the final minutes indicated genuine improvement in their attitudes. As she'd walked toward the door to escort them out of the building, Brandon had made his move. The hallway outside the multipurpose room was part of the older section of the elementary wing, where security cameras had been planned but never installed due to budget constraints. It was a blind spot in the school surveillance system, and Brandon knew it. "Hey, Miss Rodriguez," he'd called out, his voice carrying a false friendliness that should have warned her of what was coming. "I've been wondering something all semester. Do you dress like that on purpose, or are you just trying to drive us all crazy?" Emma had turned to face him, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the inappropriate nature of his comment. "Brandon, that's not an appropriate thing to say to a teacher. Please gather your things so I can walk you to the exit." But Brandon had stepped closer instead of moving toward the door, using his significant height advantage to loom over her in a way that felt deliberately threatening. "Come on, Miss Rodriguez. You can't tell me you don't know how good you look, especially in that dress. It shows off your legs in a way that makes it hard for a guy to concentrate on schoolwork." Kyle and Josh had positioned themselves on either side of the hallway, creating a human barrier that prevented Emma from easily walking past them. The formation was subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability while effectively trapping her in the confined space. Emma had felt her heart rate increase as she recognized the tactical nature of their positioning, but she'd maintained her calm exterior. "Move aside, please," she'd said firmly. "This conversation is over, and you need to leave the building now." That's when Brandon had made the comment that changed everything. "You know what I think, Miss Rodriguez? I think you dress like that because you want attention. And I think it's time someone gave you exactly what you're asking for." Before Emma could respond, Brandon had reached out and grabbed the hem of her dress. The action was so sudden and unexpected that she'd frozen for a critical moment, unable to process that a student was actually putting his hands on her clothing. In that moment of shock, Brandon had pulled hard, and the sound of tearing fabric had echoed through the empty hallway like a gunshot. The navy blue dress that Emma had chosen so carefully that morning was now hanging ruins around her legs, the modest hemline shredded to reveal far more of her figure than she'd ever intended to show in a professional setting. Brandon held a strip of torn fabric in his hand, grinning with satisfaction at his successful humiliation of the quiet teacher who dared to ignore his advances. But as Kyle and Josh laughed at their friend's boldness, none of them noticed the change that was occurring in Emma Rodriguez. Her breathing had shifted from shocked gasps to the controlled rhythm she'd learned during thousands of hours of training. Her stance had widened slightly, dropping her center of gravity in a way that would have been familiar to anyone who'd spent time in a fighting gym. Most significantly, the gentle expression that usually softened her features had been replaced by something far more dangerous. For 26 years, Emma Rodriguez had been the kind of person who avoided confrontation whenever possible. She'd been raised to respect authority, follow rules, and solve problems through patience and understanding. Her teaching philosophy was built on the foundation that every student could be reached through compassion and consistent expectations. Violence was the opposite of everything she believed education should represent. But standing in that hallway with her dress in tatters and 3 teenage boys leering at her exposed legs, Emma felt something fundamental shift inside her consciousness. This wasn't about different teaching philosophies or challenging student behavior anymore. This was assault, pure and simple, and her years of training had prepared her for exactly this moment. "That was a mistake," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made all 3 boys take an unconscious step backward. Brandon, however, was too intoxicated by his apparent victory to recognize the danger in her tone. Was it, though? He laughed, waving the torn fabric like a flag. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like we're finally seeing the real Miss Rodriguez. And I've got to say, I like this view a lot better than your usual covered-up librarian. Look." Emma's hands moved to the remaining intact portions of her dress, assessing the damage with the same clinical precision she'd once used to evaluate opponents before a fight. The skirt was beyond salvage, but the bodice remained modest and intact. More importantly, the destruction of her clothing had inadvertently freed her legs from the restrictive fabric that would have limited her movement. "You have no idea what you've just done," Emma said, and there was something in her voice now that made Kyle and Josh exchange nervous glances. Brandon, however, was too committed to his performance to back down. "I know exactly what I've done," he sneered. "I've shown everyone what happens when teachers think they can ignore me. You work for us, Miss Rodriguez. This whole school exists because of what my dad pays in taxes and donations. You're just some little girl playing dress-up and pretending to be important." That's when Emma Rodriguez, former amateur kickboxing champion, decided that it was time for Brandon Cooper to receive an education that couldn't be found in any textbook. What happened next would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew Emma Rodriguez only as the gentle third-grade teacher with a soft voice and endless patience. The transformation wasn't dramatic or theatrical, but rather a subtle shift that spoke of muscle memory developed through years of dedicated training. Her weight redistributed to the balls of her feet, her shoulders relaxed while simultaneously coiling with potential energy, and her breathing settled into the steady rhythm that had once carried her through championship rounds. Brandon Cooper had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd assumed that because Emma was small and quiet, she would remain passive when confronted with physical aggression. He'd built his entire worldview around the belief that size equaled dominance, that wealth provided immunity, and that teachers were inherently powerless against student misbehavior. In his 17 years of existence, no one had ever challenged these assumptions in a meaningful way. "You think this is funny?" Emma asked, her voice carrying a new edge that made the fluorescent lights above seem to hum more ominously. She wasn't shouting or threatening, but there was something in her tone that suggested vast reserves of controlled power waiting just beneath the surface. Brandon's grin faltered slightly, but his ego wouldn't allow him to back down in front of his friends. "Yeah, actually, I think it's hilarious." "What are you going to do about it, Teach? Give me detention? Call my dad? Write me up for the principal who plays golf with my old man every weekend?" Kyle Martinez shifted uncomfortably beside his friend, suddenly aware that the dynamic in the hallway had changed in ways he couldn't quite identify. Josh Williams took a half-step backward, his survival instincts apparently more finely tuned than those of his companions. But Brandon, intoxicated by what he perceived as complete victory, pressed forward with his verbal assault. "You know what I think happened here, Miss Rodriguez? I think you've been wanting someone to notice you for months. Walking around in those tight little dresses, bending over to help kids with their work, making sure everyone gets a good look at what you're offering. Well, congratulations, you finally got my attention." Emma's response came not in words, but in action so swift and precise that Kyle would later struggle to explain what he'd witnessed to the school administrators who questioned him. One moment Brandon was standing 3 feet away from her, holding the torn fabric like a trophy, and the next moment he was stumbling backward with empty hands, completely off balance and confused about how his apparent advantage had evaporated so quickly. What Emma had done was execute a technique called a parry and redirect, something she'd practiced thousands of times during her competitive years. When Brandon had reached out to grab more of her dress, continuing his assault, she'd simply step to the side while using a circular motion to deflect his hand away from her body. The movement was so economical and natural that it appeared almost accidental, but the result was that Brandon's own momentum carried him past her while leaving him grasping at empty air. "That's your first lesson," Emma said calmly, smoothing down what remained of her dress with the same composure she might use to straighten papers on her desk. "Power isn't about size or strength. It's about timing, technique, and understanding leverage. You just tried to use your reach advantage against someone who's been training to neutralize reach advantages since she was 18 years old." Brandon's face flushed red with embarrassment and rage. The easy victory he'd anticipated had somehow become a humiliating display of incompetence, and his friends were staring at him with expressions of confusion and dawning concern. His teenage mind couldn't process how a woman half his size had made him look clumsy and ineffective without even appearing to try. "You got lucky," he snarled, his voice cracking slightly with the strain of maintaining his aggressive facade. "That won't happen again." Emma's smile was the kind her old trainer, Tank Johnson, used to wear right before demonstrating why technique trumped brute force every single time. "You're absolutely right, Brandon. It won't happen again. Because now I'm not going to let you get close enough to put your hands on me." What Brandon didn't understand was that he'd just initiated a physical confrontation with someone who'd spent 4 years studying every possible way a larger opponent might try to use size and strength advantages. Emma had fought women who were taller, stronger, and more aggressive than Brandon Cooper, and she'd learned to turn every one of those attributes into vulnerabilities. The second time Brandon lunged toward her, Emma was ready. She'd positioned herself in the center of the hallway, giving herself room to move in any direction while limiting his ability to corner her against the lockers. When he came forward, with his arms extended, trying to grab her shoulders and use his weight to pin her against the wall, Emma simply wasn't there anymore. She'd slipped to his left side, just outside the range of his extended arms, and as his momentum carried him forward into empty space, she'd placed one hand on his back and given him a gentle push that accelerated his movement in the direction he was already going. The result was that Brandon crashed into the lockers with a metallic bang that echoed through the empty hallway, while Emma remained exactly where she wanted to be. "Lesson 2, she said, her teacher voice now carrying the authority of someone who'd never lost control of her classroom. "Never commit to an attack unless you're certain of your target. You just demonstrated the difference between aggression and strategy." Kyle Martinez had seen enough. Whatever was happening in this hallway was beyond his understanding, but his instincts told him that continuing to participate would end badly for everyone involved. "Brandon, man, maybe we should just go. This isn't worth it." But Brandon Cooper had built his entire identity around being the biggest, strongest, most intimidating person in any room. The possibility that an elementary school teacher could outmaneuver him was so threatening to his self-concept that retreat was psychologically impossible. He pushed himself away from the lockers, his breathing heavy and his face now completely flushed with exertion and humiliation. "I don't know what kind of lucky moves you think you're pulling," he gasped, "but they won't work a third time. I'm done playing around with you." Emma's expression grew serious for the first time since the confrontation had begun. She recognized the dangerous shift in Brandon's demeanor, the transition from cocky bullying to genuine rage that could lead to someone getting seriously hurt. In her fighting days, she'd learned to identify the moment when an opponent stopped thinking strategically and started relying purely on emotion and adrenaline. "Brandon," she said, her voice carrying both authority and genuine concern, "you need to stop now. Walk away and we can discuss this situation with the appropriate administrators. Continue down this path, and you're going to learn lessons that will stay with you for the rest of your life. But teenage pride combined with public humiliation had created a toxic mixture that made rational decision-making impossible. Brandon had reached the point where backing down felt like a complete destruction of his social status, even though persisting virtually guaranteed a much worse outcome. "The only lesson anyone's learning today," he snarled, "is what happens when teachers forget their place." This time when Brandon moved toward Emma, there was none of the casual arrogance that had characterized his earlier attacks. He came forward with the focused intensity of someone who understood that his reputation and self-image hung in the balance. His approach was more cautious, his movements more controlled, and his intentions clearly more violent. Emma recognized the change immediately. This was no longer a bully testing boundaries or trying to humiliate a teacher. This was a young man who felt his fundamental identity was under attack and was prepared to use serious violence to defend it. The situation had escalated beyond the point where simple redirection and evasion would be sufficient. When Brandon reached for her this time, Emma met his attack with the kind of precise counter technique that had made her a champion. As his hands came toward her, she stepped forward into his attack rather than away from it, closing the distance in a way that negated his reach advantage while putting her in position to control his movement. Her left hand caught his right wrist in a grip that utilized leverage points she'd learned through countless hours of training, while her right hand found the pressure point just below his elbow that would make resistance both painful and ineffective. The combined effect was that Brandon's arm became completely immobilized, held in a position that would cause increasing discomfort if he tried to struggle free. "This is called a standing armbar," Emma explained in the same patient tone she used to help third graders understand difficult math concepts. The human arm has multiple joints that can only bend in specific directions. When you control those joints properly, size and strength become irrelevant. Brandon's eyes widened as he realized he was completely helpless despite being nearly twice Emma's size. Every attempt to pull free only increased the pressure on his arm, and the angle at which he held his wrist made it impossible for him to generate any leverage with his superior weight and strength. "Let me go," he demanded, his voice now carrying notes of panic that hadn't been present during his earlier displays of dominance. Emma's grip remained steady and controlled. "I will, as soon as you demonstrate that you understand the situation has changed. You assaulted a teacher, destroyed personal property, and then continued to escalate the confrontation despite multiple opportunities to walk away. Those actions have consequences." Kyle Martinez and Josh Williams watched in stunned silence as their seemingly invincible leader stood completely immobilized by a woman who barely came up to his shoulder. The casual confidence they'd always associated with Brandon had been replaced by something much more vulnerable, and both boys were beginning to understand that they'd dramatically miscalculated the balance of power in this confrontation. "This is crazy," Josh whispered, his voice barely audible in the tense silence of the hallway. "How is she doing that?" Emma heard the question and chose to answer it, partly because education was her instinct even in moments of conflict, and partly because she wanted all three boys to understand exactly what they were dealing with. "Physics," she replied calmly, maintaining her hold on Brandon's arm while addressing his friends. "Leverage, joint manipulation, and an understanding of human anatomy that comes from years of studying how bodies move and react under pressure. Your friend assumed that being bigger meant being stronger, but strength without technique is just flailing around hoping to get lucky." Brandon's breathing had become labored, partly from the physical stress of being held in an uncomfortable position and partly from the psychological impact of finding himself completely powerless. His worldview was crumbling in real time, and the cognitive dissonance was almost as painful as the physical control Emma maintained over his arm. "You can't do this," he gasped, still trying to assert some form of authority even while demonstrating Complete helplessness. I'm a student, you're a teacher. There are rules about this kind of thing. Emma's laugh was soft, but carried an edge that made all three boys shiver involuntarily. You're absolutely right about there being rules, Brandon. The rule about students not assaulting teachers. The rule about respecting other people's personal boundaries. The rule about not destroying someone else's property. You broke all of those rules. And now you're experiencing what happens when rules are enforced by someone who doesn't need permission from your father to take action. The mention of his father's usual protective influence hit Brandon like a physical blow. For the first time in his 17 years, he was facing consequences that couldn't be negotiated away through family connections or political pressure. The realization that he was genuinely powerless in this situation was more terrifying than the physical discomfort Emma was inflicting. "Please," he whispered, and the word came out broken in a way that revealed just how young and scared he really was beneath all his bluster and aggression. Emma studied his face carefully, looking for signs that his fear was genuine rather than manipulative. Her years of teaching had given her significant experience in reading children's emotions, and what she saw in Brandon's eyes was authentic terror combined with the dawning understanding that actions really did have consequences. "Are you ready to listen now?" she asked, her voice gentler but still carrying the unmistakable authority of someone completely in control of the situation. Brandon nodded frantically, no longer caring how the gesture might appear to his friends. His arm was beginning to ache from the sustained pressure, and more importantly, his sense of invulnerability had been completely shattered. Emma Rodriguez had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous than a quiet, elementary teacher, and he was desperate to find a way out of this nightmare. Emma gradually released the pressure on his arm while maintaining enough control to prevent any sudden movements. As circulation returned to Brandon's limb, she stepped back just far enough to be outside his immediate reach while remaining close enough to respond if he made any aggressive moves. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice returning to something closer to her normal teaching tone but retaining the edge of steel that hadn't been there before this confrontation began. "You're going to pay for my dress. The one you destroyed was worth $120, and I expect cash on my desk tomorrow morning before first period." Brandon nodded quickly, his earlier defiance completely extinguished by the demonstration of Emma's capabilities. The money was insignificant compared to his weekly allowance, but the symbolic importance of the payment was enormous. He was being held accountable for his actions in a way that felt both foreign and terrifying. "Additionally," Emma continued, "you're going to write a formal apology letter to me, which will be copied to Principal Harris, your parents, and your basketball coach. In that letter, you're going to explain exactly what you did wrong and why your behavior was unacceptable." The mention of Coach Stevens made Brandon's stomach drop even further. The basketball coach had strict policies about character and behavior, and news of this incident could easily result in suspension from the team during the crucial final weeks of the season. "Finally," Emma said, her tone becoming even more serious, "you're going to understand that your behavior toward me and every other teacher in this school is going to change permanently. The days of using your size, your father's influence, or your athletic status to intimidate faculty members are over. If I hear about you treating any educator with disrespect, you'll discover that today's lesson was just the introduction to a much longer course of instruction." Kyle Martinez found his voice for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "Miss Rodriguez, we won't say anything about this. We'll keep it quiet." Emma turned her attention to him, and Kyle immediately understood why Brandon had been so thoroughly overwhelmed. There was something in her eyes that spoke of complete confidence and vast reserves of controlled power that made arguing with her seem not just futile but genuinely dangerous. "You're absolutely right that you won't say anything," she agreed. "But not because you're trying to protect your friend or avoid getting in trouble yourselves. You won't say anything because you understand that what happened here Today was a natural consequence of choices that were made freely. Brandon chose to assault a teacher. He chose to destroy personal property. He chose to escalate a confrontation despite multiple warnings. What followed was simply the universe providing an education in cause and effect. Josh Williams, who had remained silent throughout most of the encounter, finally spoke up with a voice that shook slightly. "Are you going to report this to the principal?" Emma considered the question carefully. The administrative route had failed her repeatedly when she'd tried to address Brandon's behavior through proper channels. Principal Harris had demonstrated that he was either unwilling or unable to take meaningful action against students whose families wielded political influence in the community. "That depends entirely on whether the lessons learned here today result in permanent changes in behavior," she replied. "I have no interest in ruining anyone's future over a mistake, even a serious one. But I also have no intention of allowing this pattern of harassment and intimidation to continue." Brandon, who had been rubbing his arm while listening to this exchange, looked up with something that might have been hope mixed with lingering fear. "If we do everything you said, pay for the dress and write the apology and change how we act, then this stays between us?" Emma nodded slowly. "If you demonstrate genuine change, not just in your behavior toward me, but in how you treat everyone in this school, then I see no need to involve additional authorities. But understand that this is contingent on real, lasting improvement. Any backsliding, any return to your previous patterns of behavior, and everything that happened here becomes part of the official record." The three boys exchanged glances, and some form of silent communication passed between them. Brandon straightened up, his natural height reasserting itself, even though everyone present now understood that physical stature was no longer relevant in this dynamic. "We understand," he said, his voice still carrying traces of the shock and fear he'd experienced, but also showing the first signs of something that might eventually develop into genuine respect. "The money will be on your desk tomorrow morning. The apology letter will be ready by the end of the week. And things are going to be different from now on." Emma studied his face one more time, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What she saw instead was a 17-year-old boy who'd just had his entire understanding of power and consequence fundamentally restructured. The arrogant bully who'd torn her dress seemed like a different person from the young man standing before her now. "Good," she said simply. Then, with a gesture that surprised all three boys, she reached into her purse and pulled out a business card for the kickboxing gym where she still maintained her membership. "Brandon, if you're genuinely interested in learning about real strength and discipline, this is where you can find both. Tell Marcus that Emma Rodriguez sent you, and he'll make sure you understand the difference between being a fighter and being a bully." Brandon took the card with hands that still trembled slightly, staring at it as if it contained the secrets of the universe. In many ways, it did represent a pathway to a completely different understanding of himself and his place in the world. As the three boys gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the building, Emma began assessing the damage to her professional wardrobe and considering how she would explain her disheveled appearance to anyone who might see her leaving the school. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to fade, replaced by the complex emotions that always followed moments of violence, even justified violence. She'd spent 2 years trying to leave her fighting background behind, convinced that education and combat were incompatible philosophies. But standing in that hallway with the torn fabric of her dress draped around her legs, Emma began to understand that perhaps she'd been wrong about the relationship between strength and teaching. Sometimes the most important lessons couldn't be found in textbooks or curriculum guides. Sometimes education required demonstrating that actions had consequences, that respect was earned rather than demanded, and that true power came from discipline and training rather than size and privilege. As Brandon Cooper walked out of Riverside Elementary and Middle School that afternoon, He carried with him not just the business card for a kickboxing gym, but the beginnings of a fundamental transformation that would reshape not only his own character, but the entire culture of intimidation and harassment that had made life miserable for teachers and students alike. Emma Rodriguez, meanwhile, stood alone in the empty hallway, surveying the scene of her victory and beginning to plan for the changes that would inevitably follow. She'd revealed her secret strength in defense of her dignity and safety, but in doing so, she'd also discovered something important about the relationship between her past as a fighter and her present as an educator. The quiet teacher's secret was no longer hidden, and tomorrow would bring an entirely new dynamic to Riverside Elementary and Middle School. News traveled through Riverside Elementary and Middle School with the velocity and unpredictability of wildfire in drought season. By 7:30 the following morning, whispered conversations buzzed in every corner of the building, from the kindergarten playground to the 8th grade lockers. The story grew and morphed with each retelling, becoming more dramatic and less accurate as it passed from student to student, teacher to teacher, and eventually from the school community into the broader social network of Millbrook. Emma Rodriguez arrived at school, wearing a simple black dress that she'd purchased during an emergency shopping trip the previous evening. The replacement garment was professional and appropriate, but it lacked the special significance of the navy blue dress that Brandon Cooper had destroyed. As she walked through the main entrance, Emma was acutely aware of the stares and hushed conversations that followed her progress down the hallway toward her classroom. The first envelope was waiting on her desk when she unlocked room 15. Inside, exactly as promised, were 6 crisp $20 bills along with a handwritten note that read simply, "I'm sorry. Thank you for the lesson, Brandon." The money represented more than just reimbursement for damaged clothing. It was tangible proof that consequences could indeed reach even the most privileged students when applied with sufficient skill and determination. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly school secretary who had worked at Riverside for over 2 decades, appeared in Emma's doorway before the morning bell had even rung. Helen Patterson was a fixture in the school community, known for her ability to navigate the complex social dynamics that existed between students, parents, faculty, and administration. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every family in Millbrook and had witnessed enough educational drama to fill several novels. "My dear," Mrs. Patterson said, closing the classroom door behind her and speaking in the conspiratorial whisper she reserved for the most sensitive school gossip, "I think you should know that the phone in the main office has been ringing since 6:30 this morning. Parents wanting to know if the rumors about yesterday afternoon are true. Principal Harris has been in his office since dawn, and I've never seen him look quite so concerned." Emma set down her lesson plans and gave Mrs. Patterson her full attention. The secretary had always been kind to her, offering guidance and support during her adjustment to the unique culture of Riverside Elementary and Middle School. If Helen Patterson was concerned enough to seek her out privately, the situation was more serious than Emma had initially realized. "What exactly are people saying happened?" Emma asked, though she suspected that the truth had been significantly embellished during its journey through the community rumor mill. Mrs. Patterson settled into one of the child-sized chairs near Emma's desk, a gesture that indicated this conversation would be longer and more detailed than a simple morning greeting. "Well, the versions vary considerably, but the basic story seems to be that you physically subdued Brandon Cooper after he made some sort of inappropriate advance. Some parents are claiming you attacked a student unprovoked. Others are saying you defended yourself against assault. The basketball parents are particularly upset because they're worried about Brandon's eligibility for the upcoming tournament." Emma felt her stomach tighten as she considered the implications of community-wide speculation about yesterday's confrontation. She'd hoped that Brandon's promise to keep the incident private would contain the fallout, but she'd underestimated the speed with which information traveled in a small suburban community. where school events were often the primary source of local drama. Has Principal Harris said anything about conducting an investigation? Emma asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the anxiety that was beginning to build in her chest. Mrs. Patterson's expression grew more serious. He's scheduled a meeting with you for 8:15, right before first period. He also has appointments with Brandon Cooper and his parents later this morning. From what I've observed, he seems to be trying to gather facts before the situation spirals completely out of control. The morning bell rang, signaling the beginning of another school day, and Emma's third-grade students began filtering into Room 15 with their usual combination of energy and sleepy confusion. She watched their familiar faces and felt a pang of protectiveness for these children who had nothing to do with the adult conflicts swirling around the school, but would inevitably be affected by any major disruption to their educational environment. 8-year-old Sophia Martinez raised her hand while hanging up her backpack in the designated cubby area. Miss Rodriguez, my big brother Kyle said something happened to you yesterday. Are you okay? Emma's heart skipped as she realized that Kyle Martinez, one of Brandon's companions during yesterday's confrontation, was the older brother of one of her most beloved students. The interconnected nature of the school community meant that the ripple effects of her confrontation with Brandon would touch families and relationships she'd never considered. I'm perfectly fine, Sophia, Emma replied with a warm smile that she hoped would reassure both the little girl and the other students who were now listening intently. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements, but that doesn't mean anyone is in danger or that anything bad is going to happen to your education here at school. As her students settled into their morning routine, Emma found herself observing their behavior with new eyes. These children looked to her not just for academic instruction, but for safety, stability, and an example of how adults should handle difficult situations. The confrontation with Brandon had been necessary and justified, but it had also revealed a side of her personality that might be difficult for young children to understand or process. The intercom crackled to life at 8:10. And Principal Harris's voice filled the classroom with its familiar tone of administrative authority. Miss Rodriguez, please report to the main office for a brief meeting before first period begins. Emma arranged for her students to work on their morning journal writing assignment and made her way through hallways that seemed unusually quiet for the beginning of a school day. Teachers and staff members she passed offered supportive smiles and encouraging nods, suggesting that the faculty's interpretation of yesterday's events was generally favorable to her position. Principal Harris's office reflected his 25 years in educational administration. The walls were covered with photographs from school events, academic achievement certificates, and sports team pictures that documented the various successes of Riverside Elementary and Middle School. His desk was organized with the precision of someone who dealt with multiple crises on a daily basis and had learned that maintaining control of paperwork was essential to maintaining control of larger situations. Richard Harris looked up as Emma entered, and she could see the stress of the morning's phone calls etched in the lines around his eyes. At 54, he'd handled numerous difficult situations involving students, parents, and community politics, but the current circumstances presented challenges that were outside his normal range of experience. Emma, please sit down, he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his desk. I want to hear your version of what happened yesterday afternoon before I meet with the Cooper family later this morning. Emma had spent much of the previous evening considering how she would explain her actions to school administrators who might not understand the context or necessity of her response to Brandon's assault. She decided that complete honesty was the only approach that would maintain her integrity, while providing Principal Harris with the information he needed to make appropriate decisions. Brandon Cooper destroyed my personal property and then physically assaulted me in the hallway outside the multipurpose room, she began, her voice steady and professional. When traditional de-escalation techniques failed, and he continued to escalate the confrontation, I used defensive techniques to protect myself and establish control of the situation. Principal Harris leaned back in his chair, studying Emma's face as she spoke. Several parents have called to express concern about reports that you have some kind of martial arts background that wasn't disclosed during your hiring process. They're worried about whether someone with fighting experience should be working with young children. Emma had anticipated this line of questioning and had prepared her response carefully. My background in kickboxing is no different from a teacher who plays recreational basketball or runs marathons on weekends. It's a personal fitness activity that has never been relevant to my professional responsibilities until yesterday, when it became necessary for self-defense. The principal made notes on a legal pad while Emma spoke, occasionally nodding or asking for clarification about specific details of the confrontation. She could see him mentally weighing the various political and practical considerations that would influence his handling of the situation. Emma, I need you to understand that Mayor Cooper is scheduled to arrive here at 10 o'clock with his son and their family attorney, Principal Harris said, his tone conveying both warning and support. They're claiming that you used excessive force against a minor and are threatening legal action against both you and the school district. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she considered the implications of facing legal consequences for defending herself against assault. She'd known that Brandon's family wielded significant political influence in Millbrook, but she'd hoped that the clear facts of the case would prevent them from pursuing aggressive retaliation. Principal Harris, I have $120 in cash that Brandon left on my desk this morning, along with a note acknowledging his inappropriate behavior, Emma said, pulling the envelope from her purse. If he was truly innocent, why would he voluntarily provide restitution for my damaged clothing? The principal examined the money and the handwritten note, his expression growing more thoughtful as he considered this new piece of evidence. This certainly complicates their narrative about you being the aggressor in this situation. However, the Cooper family is arguing that any admission of guilt from Brandon was obtained under duress after you physically intimidated him. Emma realized that she was experiencing the same frustration that had led to yesterday's confrontation in the first place. The systems designed to protect teachers and maintain order in schools were proving inadequate when faced with families who possessed the resources and connections to manipulate those systems for their own benefit. What would you like me to do? Emma asked, recognizing that Principal Harris was caught between his desire to support his faculty and the political realities of managing a school in a community where certain families expected special treatment. Before the principal could respond, the intercom on his desk buzzed with an incoming call from Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Harris, I have Dr. Chun from the school district office on line 2. She says it's urgent regarding the situation with Miss Rodriguez. Principal Harris picked up the phone and engaged in a brief, tense conversation that Emma could only partially follow from her side of the desk. She caught references to district policy, legal liability, and community relations, all phrases that suggested the situation was escalating beyond the level of individual school management. Emma, I need you to remain in your classroom today and avoid any contact with Brandon Cooper or his family, Principal Harris said after hanging up the phone. Dr. Chun is sending a district representative to observe your classes and conduct interviews with faculty members who might have relevant information about the situation. Emma nodded her understanding while internally feeling the weight of professional scrutiny that could potentially end her teaching career before it had truly begun. She'd spent years preparing for this profession and had invested her heart and soul in creating positive educational experiences for her students. The possibility of losing everything because she defended herself against assault felt both unjust and terrifying. As she walked back toward her classroom, Emma encountered Marcus Rodriguez, a 7th grade mathematics teacher who shared her surname but no family relationship. Marcus had been at Riverside for 8 years and had developed a reputation as one of the most effective educators in the middle school division. He stopped her in the hallway with an expression of concern and solidarity. "Emma, I want you to know that every teacher in this building supports what you did yesterday," he said, speaking quietly to avoid being overheard by passing students. "We've all dealt with Brandon Cooper's behavior, and we've all felt frustrated by the administration's inability to address it effectively. You did what needed to be done." The support from her colleagues provided some comfort, but Emma understood that professional sympathy wouldn't necessarily translate into protection from legal consequences or community backlash. She thanked Marcus for his encouragement and continued toward room 15, where her third-grade students were waiting with the kind of patience that 8-year-olds could only maintain for limited periods. The morning progressed with unusual normalcy, despite the undercurrent of tension that seemed to permeate the entire school building. Emma's students responded to her teaching with their typical enthusiasm, apparently unaware that their teacher was at the center of a controversy that was consuming the attention of parents, administrators, and community leaders throughout Millbrook. During lunch, Emma chose to eat in her classroom rather than face the inevitable questions and conversations that would occur in the faculty lounge. She was grading mathematics assessments when a soft knock on her door interrupted her work. Standing in the doorway was Brandon Cooper, but the young man who entered her classroom bore little resemblance to the arrogant bully who had torn her dress the previous afternoon. Brandon's usual swagger had been replaced by a hesitant, almost nervous demeanor. His eyes, which had previously held only contempt and entitlement, now showed something that might have been genuine remorse mixed with a healthy respect for Emma's capabilities. He approached her desk slowly, as if afraid that sudden movements might trigger another demonstration of her defensive skills. "Miss Rodriguez, I wanted to talk to you before my parents get here," he said, his voice lacking the aggressive confidence that had characterized all their previous interactions. "They don't know the whole story, and they're really angry about what happened." Emma set down her red pen and gave Brandon her full attention, curious about what had motivated him to seek out this private conversation despite the clear instructions from Principal Harris that they should avoid contact. "What don't they know, Brandon?" she asked, maintaining the professional tone she used with all students while remaining alert for any signs that this might be another attempt at manipulation or intimidation. Brandon shifted his weight uncomfortably, clearly struggling with concepts of accountability and honesty that were apparently foreign to his usual approach to difficult situations. "They don't know that I tore your dress first. They don't know that I was saying inappropriate things about your body. They think you just attacked me out of nowhere because you don't like athletes or something." Emma considered the implications of Brandon's revelation. If his parents were operating under the assumption that she had initiated the physical confrontation without provocation, their aggressive response to the situation made more sense. However, it also suggested that Brandon had deliberately misrepresented the events to avoid taking responsibility for his own actions. "Why didn't you tell them the truth?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Brandon's face flushed with embarrassment as he struggled to articulate feelings and motivations that he was probably experiencing for the first time. "Because I've never had to before. Whenever I get in trouble, my dad just makes it go away. I didn't think about how lying would make things worse for you." Emma felt a complex mixture of emotions as she observed this 17-year-old boy grappling with the consequences of his privileged upbringing. Part of her remained angry about the assault and the subsequent attempt to avoid responsibility. But her teacher's heart also recognized a young person who was beginning to understand the difference between right and wrong in ways that his previous experiences had never required. "What are you planning to do about it?" Emma asked, curious to see whether Brandon's apparent remorse would translate into concrete actions that might help resolve the situation. Brandon reached into his backpack and pulled out a manila folder containing several sheets of handwritten pages. "I wrote the apology letter you asked for, but I also wrote something else. It's a complete account of what really happened yesterday, with all the details I left out when I talked to my parents. I'm going to give it to Principal Harris before the meeting starts." Emma accepted the folder and quickly scanned the contents. Brandon's handwriting was surprisingly neat for a teenage boy, and his account of the previous day's events was both detailed and accurate. More importantly, it clearly established that he had initiated both the destruction of property and the physical confrontation that had led to Emma's defensive response. "This took courage to write," Emma said, acknowledging the difficulty of what Brandon was attempting to do. "Telling the truth when you've already committed to a lie is one of the hardest things anyone can do." Brandon nodded, his expression showing a maturity that hadn't been present during any of their previous interactions. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about actions having consequences. I realized that trying to avoid consequences for my actions was just creating worse consequences for other people." The lunch period was nearly over, and Emma could hear the sounds of students returning from the cafeteria and playground activities. She handed the folder back to Brandon, recognizing that the ultimate test of his apparent transformation would come when he faced his parents and their attorney with the truth about his behavior. "Brandon, changing how you act in the future is more important than apologizing for how you acted in the past," Emma said, offering him the kind of guidance she might give to any student who was struggling with difficult moral choices. "The real question is whether you're ready to become the kind of person who doesn't need to lie about his mistakes, because he doesn't make those kinds of mistakes anymore." Brandon stood to leave, then paused at the classroom door. "Miss Rodriguez, I went to the gym you recommended last night. I talked to Marcus Johnson, and he said he'd train me if I was serious about learning discipline instead of just wanting to hurt people. I'm going to start classes next week." Emma felt a surge of hope as she considered the possibility that yesterday's confrontation might ultimately result in positive change rather than just punishment and conflict. The transformation of a bully into someone committed to self-improvement and respect for others was exactly the kind of outcome that made teaching worthwhile, even when it came at significant personal cost. The afternoon brought a parade of district officials, concerned parents, and curious community members who seemed drawn to the school by the magnetic pull of controversy and drama. Emma remained in her classroom, focusing on her students and trying to maintain the normal rhythms of education despite the chaos swirling around her professional life. At 3:30, as the final bell released students to their after-school activities and family responsibilities, Principal Harris appeared in Emma's doorway with an expression that she couldn't quite interpret. He entered the classroom and closed the door behind him, suggesting that their conversation would address sensitive topics that required privacy. "Emma, I've just finished what was probably the most unusual parent conference of my career," he said, settling into one of the child-sized chairs that surrounded her reading area. The Cooper family came prepared for battle, but Brandon's confession changed everything. Emma waited for him to continue, uncertain whether the day's events had resolved in her favor or created new complications that would require additional navigation. Mayor Cooper was initially furious about the situation and was demanding your immediate termination, Principal Harris continued. However, when Brandon presented his written account of what actually happened, along with his verbal admission that he had assaulted you first, their attorney advised them that pursuing legal action would be both unsuccessful and potentially embarrassing. Emma felt some of the tension she'd been carrying all day begin to ease, though she remained cautious about celebrating prematurely. The political dynamics of small-town controversies could shift quickly, and she understood that today's resolution might not prevent future complications. "What happens now?" Emma asked, recognizing that the immediate crisis might be over, but that the long-term implications of yesterday's confrontation would continue to unfold over time. Principal Harris smiled for the first time since the crisis had begun. "Now, We move forward with a much clearer understanding of how this school will handle situations involving student misconduct. The district office has decided to implement new policies regarding harassment of faculty members, and they've asked me to develop protocols for addressing complaints that weren't being resolved through traditional channels. Emma realized that her moment of standing up to Brandon Cooper had inadvertently created an opportunity for systemic change that could benefit every teacher in the building. Sometimes individual courage could indeed catalyze broader improvements in organizational culture and policy. As Principal Harris left her classroom to continue managing the various administrative tasks that the day's events had generated, Emma began preparing for what she hoped would be a much calmer tomorrow. She organized her lesson plans, straightened her bulletin boards, and reflected on the unexpected ways that her background as a fighter had intersected with her identity as an educator. The quiet teacher's secret was no longer hidden, but perhaps that was exactly what Riverside Elementary and Middle School had needed all along. 3 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Emma Rodriguez stood before the packed auditorium of the Millbrook Community Center, addressing an audience that included teachers from 5 surrounding school districts, concerned parents, and education policy makers from the state level. The woman, speaking with quiet confidence about classroom management and personal safety, bore little resemblance to the frightened teacher who had once eaten lunch alone in her classroom to avoid difficult conversations. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. Word of Emma's successful defense against student assault had spread far beyond the boundaries of Riverside Elementary and Middle School, eventually reaching education professionals who were grappling with similar challenges in their own institutions. What had begun as a single moment of standing up to a bully had evolved into a movement focused on teacher empowerment and student accountability. Emma wore a navy blue dress remarkably similar to the one Brandon Cooper had destroyed months earlier. But the woman inside the dress had changed in fundamental ways. Her posture carried new authority, her voice projected confidence without aggression, and her eyes held the kind of steady composure that came from knowing she could handle whatever challenges might arise. The PowerPoint presentation behind her displayed statistics that told a compelling story about the changes at Riverside Elementary and Middle School since the implementation of new discipline policies. Incidents of teacher harassment had dropped by 78%. Student respect surveys showed dramatic improvement, and most significantly, academic performance had increased across all grade levels as classroom environments became more conducive to learning. "The question I'm asked most frequently," Emma said, clicking to advance her presentation to a slide showing before and after photos of her classroom environment, "is whether I regret using physical intervention to address a student discipline problem. The answer is complicated because it requires understanding the difference between violence and self-defense, between aggression and setting boundaries." In the third row of the auditorium, Brandon Cooper sat with his mother, listening intently to every word. The 17-year-old who had once terrorized teachers and students had been transformed into a young man who volunteered his time helping younger children with reading difficulties and had earned his yellow belt in kickboxing through dedicated training and disciplined practice. His presence at Emma's presentation was both a testament to personal growth and a public acknowledgement of the role she had played in his transformation. "What happened in that hallway wasn't about revenge or punishment," Emma continued, her voice carrying easily to the back of the auditorium without the need for dramatic emphasis. "It was about a moment when traditional systems failed and an individual had to choose between accepting victimization or standing up for fundamental principles of respect and dignity." The audience included several teachers who had driven significant distances to hear Emma speak, drawn by stories of her successful approach to classroom management, challenges that seemed increasingly common in schools across the region. Many of them had experienced their own versions of student harassment and administrative indifference, and they were hungry for practical strategies that went beyond the Theoretical solutions offered in most professional development programs. Dr. Janet Martinez, the superintendent of the Riverside School District, had initially been skeptical about highlighting Emma's confrontation with Brandon as a positive example of conflict resolution. However, the measurable improvements in school climate and academic performance had convinced even the most cautious administrators that Emma's approach represented something worth studying and potentially replicating. Miss Rodriguez called out a teacher from the audience during the question and answer session. How do we implement your strategies in schools where administrators are reluctant to support teachers who stand up to problematic students? Emma paused thoughtfully before responding, recognizing that this question went to the heart of the systemic issues that made situations like hers both necessary and controversial. Change often has to begin with individual teachers who are willing to model the kind of strength and professionalism they want to see in their schools. When we demonstrate that we can handle difficult situations with skill and composure, we create opportunities for administrators to support us in ways they might not have considered before. Brandon Cooper raised his hand from his seat in the audience, and Emma nodded for him to speak. The auditorium fell silent as people recognized the young man, whose transformation had become central to Emma's message about the possibility of positive change emerging from confrontational situations. Miss Rodriguez, I wanted to ask you to tell everyone about the self-defense program you started at our school, Brandon said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had once characterized his interactions with authority figures. I think people should know about the positive things that came out of what happened between us. Emma smiled at the question, recognizing it as another sign of Brandon's ongoing commitment to making amends for his past behavior while contributing to solutions that could help other students and teachers. The Riverside Self-Defense and Conflict Resolution Program was developed in response to requests from both faculty and students who wanted to learn practical skills for handling confrontational situations. She explained. The program had launched 6 weeks after Emma's confrontation with Brandon, initially meeting resistance from parents and administrators who worried about the liability issues associated with teaching physical defense techniques in educational settings. However, the curriculum Emma developed focused as much on de-escalation, situational awareness, and conflict prevention as it did on actual physical techniques. What we discovered, Emma continued, is that teaching people basic self-defense skills actually reduces the likelihood that those skills will ever be needed. Students who understand how to project confidence and set clear boundaries are less likely to become targets of bullying behavior. Teachers who know they can protect themselves are more likely to address problems before they escalate to crisis levels. The program had become so popular that it now included not only Riverside faculty and students, but participants from other schools in the district, and even some community members who had heard about its effectiveness through word of mouth. Emma taught the classes twice a week after school, with assistance from Marcus Johnson, the trainer who had helped her develop her own fighting skills during her college years. Brandon Cooper had become one of the program's most dedicated participants, and had recently begun serving as a junior instructor for younger students who were learning basic safety techniques. His transformation from bully to mentor had become one of the most compelling aspects of Emma's story, demonstrating that even the most problematic students could change when presented with appropriate challenges and support. The real success of any intervention, Emma told the audience, is measured not by how effectively it punishes bad behavior, but by how successfully it creates opportunities for people to become better versions of themselves. Brandon Cooper is living proof that confrontation, when handled with skill and compassion, can become a catalyst for positive transformation. After the presentation, Emma found herself surrounded by educators who wanted to share their own stories of classroom challenges and administrative frustrations. Many of them spoke about feeling powerless in the face of student misconduct and parental pressure, trapped between their desire to maintain safe learning environments and systems that seemed designed to prevent effective intervention. A middle-aged teacher named Sarah Chen approached Emma with tears in her eyes, explaining that she had been considering leaving education after 15 years because of ongoing harassment from a group of high school students whose behavior was being ignored by her administration. Listening to you speak today has given me hope that there might be another way to handle this situation, she said. Emma spent nearly an hour talking with Sarah and several other teachers, sharing practical strategies for documenting incidents, building support networks among colleagues, and developing the kind of personal confidence that could help them navigate difficult situations more effectively. She provided contact information for trainers in their areas who could help them develop basic self-defense skills and offered to serve as a consultant if they needed assistance implementing similar programs in their own schools. As the evening wound down and the auditorium began to empty, Brandon Cooper approached Emma with his mother, Patricia Cooper, who had become one of the most vocal supporters of the changes at Riverside Elementary and Middle School. Patricia's transformation had been almost as dramatic as her son's, evolving from an enabling parent who had always protected Brandon from consequences to an advocate for accountability and character development. Emma, I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done for Brandon and for our whole family, Patricia said, her voice carrying genuine emotion. I know it might sound strange, but that day in the hallway was the best thing that ever happened to my son. It forced all of us to confront some hard truths about the kind of person he was becoming. Brandon nodded in agreement, his expression serious and thoughtful. Miss Rodriguez, I've been thinking about going into education myself, maybe working with kids who are having the kind of behavioral problems I used to have. Do you think someone with my background could be effective in that kind of role? Emma considered the question carefully, recognizing both the potential value and the potential challenges of Brandon's career aspirations. I think your personal experience with transformation could be incredibly valuable to young people who are struggling with similar issues, she said. However, you would need to demonstrate sustained change over several years and develop the kind of professional skills that make effective educators. The conversation continued as they walked out of the community center together, discussing Brandon's plans for college, his continued training in martial arts, and his volunteer work with younger students who were dealing with behavioral challenges. Emma was struck by the contrast between this thoughtful young man and the arrogant bully who had torn her dress months earlier. Mayor James Cooper was waiting in the parking lot beside his family's car, and Emma felt a moment of tension as she remembered the political pressure his family had initially brought to bear during the aftermath of her confrontation with Brandon. However, the man who approached her seemed genuinely appreciative rather than hostile or defensive. Miss Rodriguez, I owe you an apology for my initial reaction to what happened between you and Brandon, the mayor said, extending his hand in a gesture of respect. I was so focused on protecting my son that I couldn't see that what he really needed was someone who would hold him accountable for his actions. You gave him something we had failed to provide as parents, and our entire family is grateful. Emma shook his hand while reflecting on the complex dynamics of community politics and family relationships that had made the resolution of this situation so challenging. Mayor Cooper, I think all of us learned important lessons about the difference between protecting our children and enabling their bad behavior. Brandon's growth over these past months shows that young people are capable of remarkable change when they're given appropriate challenges and support. As the Cooper family drove away, Emma stood alone in the parking lot, considering the unexpected trajectory her life had taken since that afternoon when everything changed. She had come to Millbrook hoping to be a quiet, effective teacher who could make a positive difference in the lives of her students. Instead, she had become a reluctant advocate for teacher empowerment and student accountability, speaking at conferences and developing programs that were being implemented in schools across the region. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Johnson, congratulating her on the evening's presentation and reminding her about the advanced self-defense workshop they were conducting the following weekend for a group of educators from the state capital. The quiet teacher who had once hidden her fighting background was now openly integrating her martial arts expertise with her educational philosophy, creating something new and valuable in the process. The drive back to her apartment gave Emma time to reflect on the various ways her life had changed since she had made the decision to stand up to Brandon Cooper. Her relationship with her colleagues had deepened as they recognized her as someone willing to take principled stands on difficult issues. Her confidence in the classroom had grown as she learned to project the kind of quiet authority that prevented problems before they developed. Most importantly, Emma had discovered that her background as a fighter and her calling as an educator were not contradictory forces but complementary aspects of a personality dedicated to protection, growth, and positive change. The skills she had developed in the boxing ring had indeed prepared her for challenges in the classroom, but not in the way she had originally imagined. Her apartment felt different now, no longer the refuge of someone hiding from confrontation, but the home of someone who had learned to face challenges with skill and confidence. The championship belts that had once collected dust in her closet were now displayed prominently, not as trophies of past violence but as symbols of discipline, training, and the kind of preparation that allowed effective people to handle whatever situations life might present. Emma's phone rang as she was preparing for bed, and she recognized the number of Dr. Chun from the school district office. "Emma, I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted you to know that we've received requests from 3 other districts to help them implement programs similar to what you've developed at Riverside. Would you be interested in expanding your role to include district-wide training and program development?" The offer represented an opportunity to influence educational policy and practice on a much larger scale, potentially helping thousands of teachers and students benefit from the lessons learned during her confrontation with Brandon Cooper. Emma considered the implications of accepting such a role, recognizing that it would mean moving beyond classroom teaching into areas of leadership and advocacy that she had never imagined pursuing. "Dr. Chun, I'm definitely interested in discussing the possibilities," Emma replied. "However, I want to make sure that any expanded role would still allow me to maintain my connection to direct student instruction. The classroom is where the real work happens, and I don't want to lose that perspective." After ending the call, Emma stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the quiet streets of Millbrook, a community that had been forever changed by a single moment of standing up for fundamental principles of respect and dignity. The ripple effects of that confrontation continued to expand, touching lives and institutions in ways that were still being discovered and understood. The torn navy blue dress had been replaced, but it had served its purpose as a catalyst for sure. Transformation that extended far beyond one teacher's wardrobe or one student's behavior. Sometimes the most significant changes in life came not from grand gestures or elaborate plans, but from individual moments when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things in defense of what they believed was right. Emma Rodriguez had learned that being a quiet teacher didn't mean being a weak one, that strength could be expressed through restraint as well as action, and that the best education often happened when students and teachers were challenged to grow beyond their previous limitations. The secret she had once hidden had become the foundation for a new understanding of what it meant to be both a fighter and an educator. As she prepared for sleep, Emma felt grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point in her life and career. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to apply the lessons learned from her confrontation with Brandon Cooper. But tonight, she could rest peacefully, knowing that sometimes standing up for yourself was the first step toward helping others find the courage to stand up as well. The quiet teacher's secret was no longer hidden, and the world was better for its revelation. Brandon Cooper had intended to humiliate and dominate, but instead he had helped unleash a force for positive change that would continue to influence lives and institutions for years to come. Sometimes the best lessons were indeed learned outside the traditional classroom, and sometimes the most important education happened when students and teachers discovered what they were truly capable of achieving. In the months that followed, Emma's story would continue to inspire educators and students across the country, demonstrating that individual courage could indeed create lasting institutional change. The hallway confrontation that had lasted only minutes had generated transformations that would endure for decades, proving that sometimes the smallest sparks could ignite the most significant fires of positive change. 2 years had passed since Emma Rodriguez first walked into Riverside Elementary and Middle School as a nervous young teacher, hoping to make a difference in the lives of her students. Now, as she stood in the newly constructed training facility that bore her name, the Emma Rodriguez Center for Educational Excellence and Personal Development, she marveled at how dramatically her world had expanded beyond anything she could have imagined during those early days of eating lunch alone in her classroom. The center occupied a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Millbrook, its spacious interior divided into multiple areas designed to serve the growing community of educators, students, and families who had been touched by Emma's philosophy of integrating personal empowerment with academic excellence. One section housed traditional classroom spaces where innovative teaching methods were developed and tested. Another area contained a fully equipped martial arts studio, where self-defense and conflict resolution techniques were taught to people of all ages and backgrounds. Emma moved through this center with the confident grace of someone who had found her true calling, greeting the diverse group of participants who had gathered for the facility's second anniversary celebration. The crowd included teachers from across the state, former students who had gone on to pursue careers in education and social work, parents who credited the center's programs with transforming their family dynamics, and community leaders who had witnessed firsthand the positive changes rippling through Millbrook and beyond. Near the entrance to the martial arts studio, a display case contained photographs and newspaper clippings, documenting the center's impact over its 2 years of operation. The images told a story of transformation that went far beyond any single confrontation between a teacher and a student, illustrating how individual moments of courage could evolve into movements that changed entire communities. One photograph showed Brandon Cooper, now 19 and a sophomore at the State University studying education and psychology, leading a workshop for middle school students who were struggling with anger management and social skills. His journey from bully to mentor had become one of the center's most powerful success stories, demonstrating that even the most problematic behaviors could be redirected toward positive purposes with appropriate intervention and support. Another image captured Emma working with a group of veteran teachers who had traveled from urban districts hundreds of miles away to learn techniques for handling classroom disruptions without relying on punitive measures that often pushed struggling students further toward failure. The practical skills they learned at the center had resulted in measurable improvements in both academic performance and school climate in districts that had previously struggled with high teacher turnover and low student achievement. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the state's Commissioner of Education, approached Emma as she mingled with the anniversary celebration guests. Dr. Mitchell had initially been skeptical about the center's unconventional approach to addressing educational challenges, but the documented results had convinced even the most traditional policymakers that Emma's methods deserved serious consideration and broader implementation. Emma, I wanted to personally thank you for agreeing to serve on the State Task Force for Educational Innovation, Dr. Mitchell said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of schools and millions of students. Your insights about the relationship between personal empowerment and academic achievement are exactly what we need as we work to reform discipline policies and teacher preparation programs. Emma accepted the gratitude graciously while remaining focused on the practical aspects of creating systemic change. Dr. Mitchell, I think the most important thing we can do is provide teachers with tools that prevent problems rather than just respond to them after they've already disrupted the learning environment. When educators feel confident and empowered, that confidence translates directly into more effective classroom management and better outcomes for students. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Johnson, Emma's former trainer, who had become the center's director of physical fitness and self-defense programs. Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades helping others discover their own strength, and his partnership with Emma had proven instrumental in developing the center's unique approach to combining physical and emotional development. "Emma, the delegation from the International Education Conference is here," Marcus announced, gesturing toward a group of visitors who had traveled from 3 different countries to observe the center's programs firsthand. "They're particularly interested in understanding how physical training can be integrated with traditional academic instruction to improve overall student development." Emma excused herself from Dr. Mitchell and made her way toward the international visitors, reflecting on how surreal it felt to be hosting educators from around the world who were seeking to learn from methods she had developed almost by accident during a moment of crisis. The transformation of a torn dress and a hallway confrontation into a recognized educational philosophy still amazed her on days when she stepped back to consider the broader implications of her journey. The international delegation included Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Japan, who was researching connections between martial arts training and academic performance; Professor Maria Santos from Brazil, who was studying innovative approaches to reducing school violence; and Dr. James MacLeod from Scotland, who was investigating programs that successfully addressed bullying behavior without relying primarily on punishment and exclusion. "Miss Rodriguez," Dr. Tanaka said through a translator, "we have studied the documentation of your center's impact on student behavior and academic achievement. The results suggest that your methods could be valuable in many different cultural contexts. Can you explain how physical confidence training translates into improved classroom performance?" Emma had fielded similar questions hundreds of times over the past 2 years, but she never tired of explaining the connection she had discovered between personal empowerment and educational success. When students learn that they can protect themselves and stand up for their principles, they develop a sense of agency that carries over into their academic work, she explained. Confident students are more likely to participate in class discussions, ask questions when they don't understand material, and persist through challenging assignments. The discussion continued as Emma led the international visitors through various areas of the center, demonstrating techniques that were being used successfully with students ranging from elementary age through high school. In one classroom, a group of 5th graders were practicing conflict resolution skills through role-playing exercises that taught them to de-escalate tense situations, using verbal communication rather than physical responses. In the martial arts studio, a mixed age group was learning basic self-defense techniques that emphasized evasion and escape rather than aggression and domination. Emma paused to watch Brandon Cooper working with a shy 12-year-old girl whose posture and movements had transformed dramatically over the 6 months she had been participating in the program. "The key principle," Emma explained to the visiting educators, "is that we teach people to be protectors rather than aggressors. Students learn physical skills not so they can hurt others, but so they can defend themselves and others who might be vulnerable to bullying or harassment." Professor Santos asked detailed questions about the center's approach to addressing students who exhibited aggressive behaviors, similar to Brandon Cooper's original pattern of bullying and intimidation. Emma described the careful process of channeling that energy toward positive purposes, while establishing clear boundaries and consequences for harmful actions. "We found that many students who engage in bullying behavior are actually struggling with feelings of powerlessness in other areas of their lives, Emma explained. When we help them develop genuine confidence and teach them healthy ways to express strength, the need to dominate others often disappears. Dr. McLeod was particularly interested in the center's work with teachers who had experienced harassment or assault from students. Emma led him to a quiet conference room where they could discuss the more sensitive aspects of educator safety and empowerment without disrupting the anniversary celebration activities. "The unfortunate reality," Emma said, settling into a comfortable chair across from the Scottish educator, "is that many teachers, especially women and younger faculty members, experience some form of intimidation or harassment during their careers. Traditional responses often focus on administrative intervention or legal action, but those approaches don't help teachers develop the personal confidence they need to prevent problems before they escalate." Dr. McLeod took detailed notes as Emma described the center's teacher empowerment programs, which included both physical self-defense training and psychological preparation for handling confrontational situations. The combination had proven remarkably effective at reducing incidents of student-teacher conflict while improving overall classroom management and student respect for faculty authority. "What we've discovered," Emma continued, "is that teachers who know they can protect themselves are paradoxically less likely to need those skills. Confidence projects itself in subtle ways that discourage aggressive behavior from students who might otherwise test boundaries through intimidation." As the afternoon progressed, Emma found herself drawn into conversations with parents whose children had been transformed by their participation in the center's programs. Jennifer Walsh, whose 14-year-old son had been a victim of persistent bullying before learning self-defense techniques, approached Emma with tears of gratitude in her eyes. "Ms. Rodriguez, I wanted you to know that Tommy stood up to his bullies for the first time last week," Jennifer said, her voice filled with emotion. "Not by fighting them, but by using the confidence techniques you taught him. He looked them in the eye and told them their behavior was unacceptable, and they actually backed down. It was like watching my son become a different person." Similar stories were shared throughout the afternoon by parents, teachers, and students who had found new strength and purpose through their involvement with the center's programs. Emma listened to each account with the same attention and care she had once devoted to her third-grade students' reading progress, recognizing that every individual transformation represented a victory against the forces of intimidation and powerlessness that plagued too many schools and communities. As evening approached and the anniversary celebration began to wind down, Emma found herself standing alone in the martial arts studio where so much of the center's most important work took place. The space was quiet now, but during regular operating hours it filled with the sounds of students discovering their own strength and resilience under the guidance of instructors who understood that true martial arts were about protection and personal development rather than aggression and domination. Brandon Cooper appeared in the doorway, having changed from his formal presentation clothes into the comfortable workout gear he wore when assisting with evening classes. His transformation over the past 2 years had been so complete that visitors to the center often had difficulty believing he was the same person who had once terrorized teachers and students at Riverside Elementary and Middle School. "Miss Rodriguez, I wanted to talk to you about something before I head back to campus," Brandon said, his voice carrying the respectful tone that had replaced his earlier arrogance. "I've been accepted into the graduate program in educational psychology, and I want to focus my research on intervention strategies for students with behavioral problems, like I used to have." Emma felt a surge of pride as she considered how far Brandon had traveled from the angry, entitled teenager who had torn her dress in a moment of cruel impulse. His journey toward becoming an advocate for other struggling students represented exactly the kind of transformation that made all the challenges and controversies of the past 2 years worthwhile. "That's wonderful news, Brandon," Emma replied, settling onto one of the benches that lined the studio walls. What specific aspects of intervention are you hoping to research? Brandon's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how to articulate ideas that had been developing over months of reflection and study. I keep thinking about how different my life might have been if someone had challenged my behavior earlier, before it became such an ingrained pattern. I want to understand how to identify students who are heading down the path I was on and intervene before they hurt others or themselves. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics ranging from early warning signs of bullying behavior to the most effective techniques for helping aggressive students develop empathy and emotional regulation skills. Emma found herself impressed by the depth of Brandon's understanding and his genuine commitment to using his personal experience to help others avoid similar mistakes. "Miss Rodriguez," Brandon said as their discussion drew to a close, "I know I've thanked you before, but I need you to understand that you saved my life that day in the hallway. Not just from getting in more trouble, but from becoming the kind of person who causes real harm to others. I was heading toward a future that would have destroyed multiple lives, and you stopped that trajectory." Emma considered his words carefully, recognizing the truth in his assessment while also understanding that his transformation had ultimately been his own choice and responsibility. "Brandon, what happened between us was a catalyst, but the real change came from your decision to face the truth about your behavior and commit to becoming someone better. That choice took courage, and it's a choice you've had to make every day since then." As Brandon left to return to his university studies, Emma remained in the quiet studio, reflecting on the unexpected ways her life had unfolded since that afternoon when everything changed. The center that surrounded her represented far more than a business venture or career advancement. It was the physical manifestation of a philosophy that had emerged from a moment of crisis and grown into a movement that was touching lives across multiple communities and cultures. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Patricia Cooper, Brandon's mother, who had become one of the center's most dedicated volunteers and advocates. The message included a photo of Brandon working with a group of at-risk youth at a community center near his university, along with a note that read, "Thought you'd like to see how Brandon is applying everything he learned at your center to help other kids who are struggling with anger and behavioral issues." Emma smiled as she looked at the image, recognizing in Brandon's patient, encouraging demeanor with the young people the same qualities she tried to model in her own work with challenging students. The cycle of transformation continued as those who had been helped found ways to help others, creating expanding circles of positive influence that reached far beyond any single institution or program. The custodial staff began their evening cleaning routine, and Emma gathered her belongings to head home to the apartment she had purchased 6 months earlier in a quiet neighborhood where she could walk safely at any hour. The financial success of the center had provided her with security and independence she had never expected to achieve so early in her career, but more importantly, it had given her a platform for continuing to develop and share the methods that had emerged from her confrontation with Brandon Cooper. As she drove through the streets of Millbrook, Emma noticed the subtle changes that had occurred in the community over the past 2 years. The local newspaper regularly featured stories about positive youth development and innovative educational approaches. The city council had allocated funds for expanded after-school programs that incorporated conflict resolution and personal empowerment training. Even the high school basketball program, once known primarily for athletic achievement, had gained recognition for its emphasis on character development and community service. Her apartment felt like a sanctuary at the end of each busy day, decorated with mementos from her competitive fighting days, alongside awards and recognition she had received for her work in education. The championship belts that had once seemed irrelevant to her teaching career now served as daily reminders that the skills and confidence developed in one area of life could indeed transfer to completely different challenges and contexts. Emma's evening routine included practicing the martial arts forms that had become as much a part of her identity as her dedication to education. The movements that had once prepared her for competition now served as meditation and stress relief, helping her maintain the physical and mental balance necessary for handling the demands of running a successful center while continuing to develop new programs and methodologies. As she moved through the familiar sequences of punches, kicks, and defensive techniques, Emma reflected on the phone call she had received that morning from a publisher interested in turning her story and methods into a book that could reach educators and students worldwide. The prospect of sharing her approach with an even broader audience was both exciting and daunting, representing another step in the evolution from elementary school teacher to internationally recognized advocate for educational innovation. The book would tell the complete story, from the nervous young woman who had hidden her fighting background to avoid seeming unsuitable for working with children, through the confrontation that revealed her true strength, to the development of methods that were now being studied and implemented by educators around the world. But most importantly, it would provide practical guidance for teachers, parents, and students who were seeking ways to create more respectful, empowering educational environments. Emma's phone rang as she finished her practice routine, and she recognized the number of Dr. Chen from the State Education Department. "Emma, I hope I'm not calling too late, but I wanted you to be the first to know that the governor has approved funding for pilot programs based on your methods in 20 schools across the state. This represents the largest investment in innovative discipline and empowerment programs in our state's history." The news represented validation of everything Emma had worked to achieve since that day when Brandon Cooper had torn her dress and inadvertently set in motion a series of events that would transform both their lives and the lives of countless others. The quiet teacher who had once hoped simply to make a difference in the lives of her third-grade students had become a catalyst for systemic change that was improving educational experiences for students across multiple states and countries. After ending the call, Emma stood at her living room window, looking out at the peaceful suburban street where children played safely and families lived without fear of the kind of bullying and intimidation that had once seemed like inevitable aspects of growing up. The work was far from finished, and there would always be new challenges and opportunities for growth. But the foundation had been laid for a different kind of educational environment, where strength was measured by the fine ways ability to protect and empower rather than to dominate and destroy. The torn navy blue dress had been forgotten long ago, replaced by hundreds of other outfits that Emma wore with the confidence of someone who knew she could handle whatever situations might arise. But the lessons learned in that hallway confrontation continued to influence every aspect of her work, reminding her daily that sometimes the most important changes in the world began with individual moments when ordinary people chose to stand up for extraordinary principles. As she prepared for sleep, Emma felt grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point in her life and career. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to apply the lessons learned from her confrontation with Brandon Cooper, but tonight she could rest peacefully, knowing that her decision to fight back had created ripples of positive change that would continue expanding for years to come. The quiet teacher's secret had become a global movement, and the world was indeed better for its revelation. Sometimes the best lessons were learned outside traditional classrooms, and sometimes the most important education happened when people discovered what they were truly capable of achieving when they refused to accept defeat. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.